Welcome, everyone, to the Cotton 2040 Masterclass series. This is the fifth of 6 masterclasses that are taking place throughout October, facilitated by Willis Towers Watson's Climate and Resilience Hub, supported by Forum for the Future and funded by the Loudest Foundation. I'm Charlene Collison from Forum for the Future, and I'm pleased to be your host. You'll note that you've been muted, and we do encourage you to add any questions that you'd like to ask during the session in the Q&A. So you can activate the Q&A panel at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen and select Q&A and pop your question in there. We will come back to it after we've heard the speakers, and we'd really like to respond to the questions that are coming up for you. Also, this session will be recorded, and it is best if you watch it through a desktop device. If you're watching it through a mobile phone, you may have some technical issues, so do join us through a desktop device if you can. So, cotton, like most agricultural crops, is braced for some very significant challenges through climate change, as we've already seen, and as we know through our research, will be increasing. We've been documenting this through our climate impacts workstream in Cotton 2040 and through the research that we've published with Willis Towers Watson. The Cotton 2040 initiative has been working since 2015 to encourage collective action on the sustainability issues that are critical to the cotton sector's future, and climate change is a feature one of those. And so through October, as part of this, we've been hosting a series of 6 masterclasses covering a range of climate topics. And these are tailored for the cotton industry to help brands and retailers build their understanding and capacity to embed climate adaptation into strategy and targets. Today's session is focusing on risk management through insurance, which is a critical area for all agricultural sectors, including cotton. And we're very pleased to be joined today on this panel by 3 leaders within Willis Towers Watson's Climate and Resilience Hub. We're joined by Lydia Brown. Lydia specializes in advising public and private sector entities on disaster risk management strategies and on financing approaches. And we're also joined by Jamie Pollard, and Jamie's role involves designing, calibrating, and validating disaster risk models to support insurance product design and broader disaster risk management recommendations. So we have a lot to talk about. I'm going to hand over to Lydia to kick us off. Lydia, over to you.
Hi everyone, I am Lydia Brown and I am really excited to welcome you to the 5th workshop of the Cotton 2040 Insight into Action Forum for the Future. Today I will be talking you through risk management through insurance. Now, for those of you that have just got scared by the word insurance or probably more likely bored, don't worry, you probably don't know insurance like I know insurance, and fingers crossed by the end of this workshop, you will also be excited by its vast capabilities just like me. Many of you may have come across insurance, perhaps in the form of travel insurance. It's kind of one of those things where you think, is it really necessary? What's the chances of my luggage getting lost at the airport? And then you arrive at your destination and you haven't got your luggage. You can't start that family holiday that you've been waiting months and months to go on. You see, insurance involves this bigger picture thinking, knowing that the world being what it is, things go wrong, and acting before those things go wrong to reduce the impact. Today, we're going to take this bigger picture thinking and look at ways in which insurance has been applied, but in a disaster context. So for those of you that attended last Thursday's Masterclass on Governance and People, you have had Hannah and Kate talk you through reasons why people at all levels of the supply chain matter. They looked at why supporting communities and workers who are most vulnerable to climate risk is important for your organisation. And hopefully you would have agreed and then thought to yourself, but how? Well, one of the answers to your question is insurance. Next slide, please. So we're going to start this workshop by talking through the driver and why this is an important topic. Next slide, please. So hopefully you should be able to see a map of the world on your screen and a few countries highlighted in purple. And if you haven't already guessed, the 10 countries which have been highlighted are the top 10 cotton producing countries in the world. As you can see, this includes the United States, Brazil, Turkey, Pakistan, India, China, and Australia. These are all huge players. But this year, we've seen numerous disasters across the globe. From extreme floods to droughts, from wildfires to landslides, from tropical cyclones to frosts, there's been a huge impact felt worldwide. So let's take a deep dive into some of the countries where the disasters have had major impacts on the cotton supply chain this year. Next slide. The United States is a huge producer and exporter in cotton, producing around 4,000 metric tons a year, with the cotton mostly being grown in the Cotton Belt, an area that comprises seven states, including Virginia, Arizona, Mississippi, and Texas. Now, you may already know this, but Texas is United States' biggest producer, accounting for 45% of all the country's cotton production. This year, Texas has its smallest cotton crop in 13 years. Why? Because Texas is facing its worst drought since 2011. But drought is not uncommon in Texas. It is a reoccurring problem. Next slide, please. So moving over to China. China produces 3,500 metric tons a year, around 20% of the world's cotton. China's cotton industry employs 10 million people in 24 different provinces, involving 300 million in its production. And I realize the Xinjiang region is very controversial at the moment, but in terms of disasters, the region is very similar to the US and has been experiencing drought and heat waves, but there has been an added risk. Xinjiang borders are mountainous. The increased temperatures result in accelerated glacial melting, which then cause landslides, flash floods, and mudslides. Next slide. So moving to a very familiar country, Pakistan. You may have seen this on the news, that there has been extreme flooding in Pakistan with 1/3 of the country underwater, killing roughly 2,000 people. In terms of cotton, an estimated 45% of the country's cotton has been ravaged by storms. This has global consequences, sending the price for cotton sky high. This is nothing new. We all knew climate change would change the climate in unprecedented ways, and we need to start supporting the cotton plant. The thing is that cotton is much like me, a sensitive soul. Give me a heat wave and I will wilt and probably demand a lot of water. And then too much rain and I'm a bit grumpy and my feet get wet, which all equates to an unhappy Lydia and an unhappy cotton plant. Droughts in America, landslides and droughts in China, and floods in Pakistan, with more disasters occurring globally. We in the disaster risk industry, we call this multi-hazard risk, where more than one disaster can occur in the same area. You in the cotton industry will call this a disruption to the supply chain. Next slide, please. So to carry on from what I was saying, insurance is one of many tools that can be used to manage the risk in the supply chain. In today's workshop, me and Jamie will talk you through 3 different levels where insurance can be applied through the cotton supply chain. I'll start by looking at the producer level in terms of producer level in particular at the cotton farming. Then Jamie will look at de-risking the supply chain at the company level in terms of business interruption insurance. Then Jamie will bring to the table an idea which could be applied at the industry level, cross-industry collaboration. Although never been applied to the cotton industry, there is no reason it can't be. Jamie will take you through a few case studies in other industries where this approach has been successful. Next slide. So the challenge and what we are already seeing. Next slide. And we're going to kick this off by a poll just to give me an idea of your feelings about insurance. It should be on the bottom right. So could you answer the question, what do you feel are the most significant challenges to insurance as a tool for managing climate risk? Now, there are a few options, but could you pick your top 3, please? And you have about 10 seconds left to choose. Hopefully the answers will come out up. Ah, yeah, there you go. Okay. Okay, so that's very interesting. So for those of you that picked a lack of information about possible options, well, you've come to the right place. Hopefully after this workshop, we will have covered that. Okay, so the next slide, please. So the first concept that I want to introduce is parametric insurance. You may or may not have come across this idea before, but again, don't worry. I'm going to take you through this. And if later you don't quite get it, you can ask questions or read the supplementary reading content that covers what parametric insurance is. Okay, so for those of you who live, or can we go back to the previous slide? Okay, so for those of you that live in the UK and experience the Great British weather, I want you to all have a bit of a think about what very common disaster occurs in the UK. Very similar to Pakistan, but obviously not on the same scale. So yes, for those of you that were thinking floods, you are correct. A typical insurance you may have come across is indemnity insurance. So let's go back to flooding in the UK. Now, imagine you live within a flooded area and it is your house that has been damaged. It is unlivable. The structural damage includes your floors, that's about 5 grand. And the foundation has got a huge crack in it, that's about 10 grand. And then don't get me started on the mold that's already started growing. So let's say you did take my advice from earlier and you did buy insurance. So after a flood, a person comes along, looks at the damage to your house, and it's a tick, tick, tick. The damage correlates to a certain payout. But it takes 2 to 4 weeks for you to receive that payout. For that time, you're in a limbo phase, waiting to rebuild your life. Now, that is the UK, where the disaster is relatively small and the insurance process, though debatable, is relatively quick. Now imagine you're in a developing country like Pakistan. And not only is 1/3 of the country underwater, but everyone is claiming insurance. Indemnity insurance in this context can take more than 2 years. That is 2 years in limbo. Now imagine that I say to you that you could receive the compensation claim days after the flood. That the payout is not about the damage done to your house, but that the magnitude of the flood and your house being within an area correlates to the payout. Pre-arranged, fast and transparent. That is parametric insurance. Before the event occurs, there are predefined parameters. So in the case of cotton in Pakistan, let's say you have a cotton farmer with around 500 acres of cotton, and you say that a certain amount of rain correlates to a certain amount of damage, and then that correlates to a certain amount of payout. Then all that has to be done is monitoring of the area, and when the disaster occurs, a triggered compensation occurs. So hopefully you understand a bit better how parametric insurance works. But what if I say to you, we can take it one step further? Instead of waiting for a disaster to occur, what if you could put things in place so that cotton farmers can be resilient to droughts or floods? For example, drought. Drought is a disaster. As a disaster, is one part about increased temperatures and the lack of rain, but another part is due to water management. Cotton farmers can adopt climate adaptation techniques like water-saving irrigation technology, such as micro-irrigation or low-pressure irrigation. But there are loads of ways in which resilience can be built before the disaster occurs. So in our next slide, we're going to have a 2-minute video from Naveen, Chief Executive of the Aga Khan Rural Support Programme. And he's going to talk through different ways he works with cotton farmers in India, talking about ways they build resilience to disasters.
Hello, I am Naveen. I work with the Aga Khan Rural Support Program as its Chief Executive. We work with over 40,000 cotton farmers across Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra. Most of our work is integrated and at the landscape level. We work on rehabilitating soil health, biodiversity, and water productivity. We also help farmers with regenerative agriculture and linking them with the markets. In the recent few years, we have seen extreme weather events in the areas where we work. There were cyclones, intense rainfalls, and droughts, which has affected cotton farmers. It has not only led to severe soil erosion but also led to loss of productivity and biodiversity for the cotton farmers. Hence, it is very important to mitigate the impact of these extreme weather events. One of the ways to do this is to provide better agriculture practices, knowledge to the farmers. Financial inclusion is very important for smallholder farmers. One of the finest examples is that we have provided subsidized loans to the cotton farmers for installing drip irrigation in their farms. It has been done with the support of Loud's Foundation. It has not only helped in improving the cotton productivity, but there has been huge improvement in the productivity of water in the cotton farms. Hence, the examples like this, where subsidized and affordable loans are provided to smallholder farmers, can really help these farmers in financial inclusion and better livelihoods. Thank you.
Okay, so next slide. So this next slide is one I am incredibly passionate on raising awareness. Now, this may or may not come as a surprise to you, but disasters are not gender neutral. Women and men do not have the same chance of survival. Women and children are 14 times more likely than men to die in a disaster. The conclusion is not that it is due to women's vulnerability, but it has been found to be society. Society creates roles based on gender, which lead to different vulnerabilities. So let's have a bit of a think about that. Some of you may know the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, or called the Boxing Day tsunami. Or if you haven't heard of that, you may have watched the movie The Impossible. The tsunami hit countries around the Indian Ocean, killing 250,000 people. Oxfam compared the number of females and male deaths. They found that in some villages, females comprised 80% of those killed. The conclusion was that society creates roles for women. For example, men are more commonly likely to learn how to swim than women in some societies. In some places, women are not permitted to be outside the home without being accompanied by a male, meaning that if a warning was issued and evacuation was to occur without a male relative around, women may have chosen to not evacuate. It was also determined by women's jobs in society. Women were on the shoreline working and waiting for their fisher husbands to return with the morning catch when the tsunami hit. All these factors lead to greater vulnerabilities for women. So to head back to Pakistan as an example, the main cotton pickers in Pakistan are women, with an estimated 500,000 cotton pickers in the country. This means that when a cotton crop is ruined by a disaster, it is women that bear the brunt of the impact. This is something to consider when thinking about insurance at the producer level. You can't just go for an insurance product that you would hope to target vulnerable groups. It has to be explicit with who it wants to target and be designed and implemented in such a way that would work for them. Now, moving on to Jamie to talk us through the next levels where insurance can be applied to the cotton supply chain.
Next slide, please. Thank you very much, Lydia. So Lydia has provided a clear example through parametric insurance of the way in which insurance can be used to de-risk the cotton supply chain at the producer level. But it's also possible that the cotton supply chain may be disrupted at other points, closer perhaps to the brands and retailers, for example. As Lydia has already mentioned, the cotton supply chain, and this came up in the poll actually, it's a very complex linkage of different production stages and transport networks. So identifying the areas within that chain which are most vulnerable to climate impacts is a really important way to understand and to de-risk the potential impacts that you may face as brands and retailers trying to take cotton from that production setting all the way through to consumers. The icons that you can see on the screen here are just a few examples of the critical infrastructure. So the nodes like ports, production facilities and airports, and also the linkages like roads or railways, which take your cotton from that production site all the way through ultimately to a consumer in whatever form it comes to them as. So if you think about something like a port, for example, you may be concerned about the impacts of chronic climate hazards like sea level rise, or extreme events like storm surges, which may be associated with hurricanes and other tropical storms. If we're considering a production facility, that facility may be vulnerable to flooding, or the workers there might be vulnerable to the impacts of drought. So thinking about these key nodes and linkages in the supply chain is a really important first step to establish how we might start to manage this risk. It's also important to consider that you not only have these, what we might call natural hazards, but also political and socioeconomic forces which might disrupt the production which is taking place or the transport of goods from one place to another. Now, within the insurance industry, the product that has been developed to deal with these kinds of risks is known as business interruption insurance. And it's essentially insurance against lost income resulting from this disruption to your supply chain. When it comes to actually applying this kind of product, it's possible that you could focus on a specific node or linkage within the chain, so a particular port that you know is really vulnerable to storm surge, for example. Or you can take a more general approach and insure against that lost income regardless of where the impact comes along the supply chain. I'm aware there have been previous seminars which have focused on supply chain mapping and trying to identify the areas which are most at risk for the cotton industry as a whole. And you can also do specific mapping for a particular company which is interested. And there are also techniques which have been developed to start to do this for certain key nodes within supply chains around the world. So, for example, we've been working with the Cambridge Centre for Risk Studies to create a port risk index, which essentially identifies the ports which are most at risk from natural hazard impacts, geopolitical disruptions, and also health-related risks. So that kind of supply chain understanding is really critical to identifying where exactly these kind of risks may emerge from. Next slide, please. Now, both at the producer level and at the company level, the overall aim of these kind of approaches, these risk management tools, is to boost the resilience of your supply chain to unexpected events. And it's those acute events that insurance is really essentially well suited to address. At the producer level, as Lydia has mentioned, it means thinking about encouraging environmentally and socially sustainable production practices. And at the company level, it's more about this quantifying and protecting against unexpected events. In both cases, it might be quite difficult to get these kind of initiatives going just at the single company level. So this slide sort of focuses on cross-industry collaboration and how working across the industry may be a more effective way to pilot production-focused parametric insurance products, for example, or to start initiatives that would support supply chain mapping across the industry as a whole, which would benefit multiple actors. Now, the examples I want to provide actually come from the insurance industry, which might typically be seen as a highly competitive industry, lots of people competing on price and trying to crowd each other out. But there have been many pretty successful cross-industry initiatives within insurance to actually extend the kinds of tools and techniques that we've been talking about today to areas perhaps where there isn't much insurance or not so much awareness around risk management techniques, and also to new sectors where these kind of approaches are less familiar. A really good example of that is something called the Insurance Development Forum, which is a cross-industry partnership which brings together not only insurance industry players, but also people from academia, people from NGOs, and also the governance sector. The idea of the Insurance Development Forum is basically to bring all these people together around one table and come up with solutions to challenges which one company on its own might not necessarily have an interest in pursuing. So, for example, extending insurance to areas where it hasn't traditionally been a risk management tool that has been used a lot. So, for example, in South America, where although you have a large number of hazards and high level of vulnerability and exposure, the level of insurance among individuals is not very high. So the Insurance Development Forum does this through a number of working groups which focus on different key aspects of that problem. So a working group thinking about how do we model the risk in a particular area, one thinking about what is the regulatory need of a parametric insurance product, for example. And this has been really successful in creating that kind of pre-competitive space where as an industry you can push forward an agenda without that kind of level of competition getting in the way. Another example is something called the Insurance Resilience Solutions Fund, which again is about funding cross-industry consultancy projects. So in addition to having this kind of discussion forum, you actually have some dedicated funding to do actual implementation on the ground. And we participated in one of these for a really fantastic scheme, which looks at extending insurance to coral reef ecosystems. So something which is on the face of it, completely out of the blue and not something that a particular company would necessarily think about pursuing. So it'd be really interesting, perhaps in the discussion, to hear from you about what sorts of existing cross-industry initiatives there are, which perhaps some of these risk management techniques could be discussed in. And if there aren't those sort of initiatives, how we might get them going. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So we've spoken a little bit about the opportunities and about how we might move towards some solutions already. Appearing on your screen now, you'll see a poll, which is slightly simpler than the last one. It's a yes, no, maybe. And the question is, would you support an industry-wide collaboration to finance insurance premiums along the cotton supply chain, which might help to reduce the kind of climate impacts on the producers, which ultimately underpin the industry? Okay, fantastic. So it's great to see that nobody doesn't want to support a cross-industry collaboration. Perhaps there's a slightly leading question, but there's also a bit of uncertainty in there, so a few maybes as well. It'd be really interesting to hear maybe in the chat or in the discussion afterwards whether there are some initiatives which would be suitable for this kind of discussion already, and to hear about those. Thank you. Next slide, please. So just to provide a little bit of recap and think about how some of these ideas that Lydia and I have spoken about might actually come into implementation. I think as we've both said over and again, in order to effectively manage risk in the cotton supply chain, you first need to understand it. And the key to that is supply chain transparency. So you need to know where cotton is being produced, how it's being transported and transformed into products, and then even where those products are being sold. Typically, I think as brands and retailers, there'd be greater understanding towards one end of that supply chain than the other. And taking a kind of industry view on improving that transparency could be a really valuable step. The second step is around what do you actually do? So which risk management tools are available to us? And we've suggested three broad approaches today. At the producer level, parametric insurance is a nice example and a proven example where you can help to provide finance to producers in order to boost their resilience to extreme climate-related shocks. At the company level, we can think about those critical nodes and linkages within the supply chain and how we can protect them against unforeseen events, whether that is on the climate side or even the social and political side. And then at the industry level, in order to implement some of these more novel ideas, collaboration is really key. Next slide, please. So to finish, just a few key questions that if you have any thoughts on, it'd be great to hear in the session today. So first, what can brands and retailers do to support insurance uptake? And that involves understanding when it might be appropriate and also where in the supply chain it could be most useful. How do these sorts of measures, how can they be used to support the well-being of individuals and communities along the supply chain? And we've spoken about producers today, but there are also similar applications for those working more around the production and even the transport of cotton products. Are there opportunities for risk pooling, so that kind of collaborative approach? If you have, for example, multiple producers being covered under a larger parametric insurance scheme, you can get various economies of scale and access benefits that way. And then how do these solutions together help to progress towards a more just and sustainable cotton industry? So obviously these are pretty big questions, but any initial thoughts would be fantastic to hear. Next slide, please. And I believe that's everything from Lydia and I. I think we will be handing back to Charlene for the discussion session. Thank you.
That's right. So we're going to go into the Q&A now, and we've got a few questions coming through. Please add them into the Q&A section, and we'll answer as many of them as we have time. So thank you, Lydia and Jamie. The first question I'm going to direct to Jamie because it addresses something you've just covered. What would be required to develop a parametric insurance product for smallholder farmers? So specifically for the smallholder farmer, because as we know, over 65 or so % of cotton farmers are smallholder farmers, 10 hectares or less. How might that work, Jamie?
Sure, thanks, Charlene. Yeah, really good question. So I guess there are two things that stick out. So the first one, as I just mentioned, is working out which producers are most important to cover under a parametric insurance product. So which ones are most critical to a particular supply chain, or which countries or areas are most in need of that kind of financial stability and protection from extreme events. So that would be the first kind of defining the problem requirement. The second thing would be more around how do you actually finance that insurance, because our experience suggests that, at least initially, the farmers, cotton producers themselves, won't necessarily have the financial ability to buy insurance themselves. And I think that's where that industry collaboration comes in. Given that boosting the resilience of these individuals is beneficial for the resilience of the supply chain as a whole, I think the kind of brands and retailers and the broader industry has a responsibility to maybe at least partially fund some of that kind of insurance premium, so the price that you pay for that cover against the extreme events. The other place where we might find some kind of support for that financing element is through governments and also multilateral development banks like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank, perhaps.
Thanks, Jamie. Lydia, anything from you to add?
No, I think that was very well covered by Jamie.
Okay. So let's go to the next question, which again is one for you, Jamie, because it relates to parametric insurance and the information that you presented about how it affects particular groups, particularly women and children, is just staggering. Tell us more about how parametric insurance has been applied to vulnerable groups, or has it?
Sure, yeah. So there are examples where this approach has been used before, specifically in the agricultural sector and specifically focused on vulnerable groups. A good example is something called the Africa Risk Capacity, which is what we call a risk pool. So it brings together multiple different countries and the vulnerable groups within them. And it offers parametric insurance for drought impacting on these farmers. And the way that it works is that there's a kind of platform for risk modeling and understanding where drought may hit and how bad it might be. And then there's also a process for financing the premium for those farmers and then actually distributing the payouts to them so that they can use the money in a timely fashion to take actions to help protect against the impacts of droughts. So that's the Africa Risk Capacity. Yeah, a really good example of something that's actually been implemented and is working to help boost the resilience of vulnerable groups.
Thank you. And here's a question to you both, and it's a question that's very close to our hearts in the Cotton 2040 initiative. There's a question about what the most important elements to foster impactful cross-industry collaboration are. Now, Cotton 2040, has in itself been fostering cross-industry collaboration. It is a multi-stakeholder initiative, and we've been working across a range of areas in cotton. We know that creating and maintaining collaboration is really hard, and it's really essential. What are your views on what it would take to foster this in insurance?
Sure, I can offer a thought first. So I think that a really important thing from our experience is to implement things, to try things, and if they fail, that's okay. You learn from it, and you can do it again. So I think in addition to having the kind of forums for discussion, which is super important for exploring new ideas, it's also great if you can put together projects where you aim to implement, in the case of insurance, actual risk management approaches on the ground. And whether that is understanding the supply chain by thinking about how you might model the different hazards, or whether it's talking to producers to understand what it is that they feel is driving vulnerability. Either way, sort of acting from either end, actually implementing things on the ground, I think, is super important.
Thanks, Jamie. Lydia, anything from you?
No.
Okay. I think I will just add then that the motivation behind running these masterclasses through the Cotton 2040 initiative and in partnership with Forum and Willis Towers Watson was in a way to facilitate collaboration by helping people understand the issues. And I think this is a first step, on the journey to understand what the risks through your supply chain are, and then map out where those points of collaboration are. We hope very much that this is helping all of you online to begin or further that process. So that brings us to the end of the 5th masterclass. If you would like to learn more about Cotton 2040 and the work that we're doing across the various work streams, in addition to this work stream on climate change, we're also running work streams in testing business models such as ecosystem services and helping brands to scale their uptake of sustainable cotton. Please contact my colleague Hannah Caneen from Forum for the Future. If you would like to learn more about the topic discussed today, you want further guidance on what your next steps might be as a company along your climate journey, then please contact the panelists at Willis Towers Watson. We actually have answered today's questions. If there are any further questions you want to post in the chat now, we will be keeping a list of them and getting back with answers to any questions that have been posed throughout these series after the masterclasses have finished. So we have our final masterclass this Thursday, the 27th of October. Please tune in and join us. And then lastly, we have a quick request before you leave. There's a post-session survey that we're dropping into the chat now. If you complete this, it will help us enormously in understanding what worked and what to keep working on in the final and any future sessions. And it also gives you access to a summary of the key points of today. So that's it from us. Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists, Jamie and Lydia, and to all of our colleagues at Willis Towers Watson and Forum. Goodbye.